The small village of Ina, Illinois, population around 500 people, was shook to its core when it was discovered that an entire family had been massacred in the most brutal way imaginable. Keith and Elaine Dardeen, along with their 3-year-old son Peter and newborn daughter Casey, were all murdered in a way that was nearly incomprehensible to the town. As shocking as this was, the story got even stranger. There were rumors of satanic cults, serial killers, and a crazed psychopath possibly running around their small community. There was no clear motive, and police were stumped. The Dardeen family murders remain one of the most disturbing and confusing crimes in Illinois history. Who could have done this in the way that they did it? Who has so little compassion that they can not only kill adults, but children? In this episode, we'll go through what happened, the theories that surround the case, and some very chilling details. Before I begin, however, I want to warn you that the following episode contains extremely graphic and disturbing content. The crimes that are discussed involve brutal violence, and some details may be deeply upsetting, even for those who are familiar with true crime. If you are sensitive to descriptions of extreme violence, or if you're listening with younger audiences, you may want to skip this episode or proceed with extreme caution. Welcome to the Beach House 34 True Crime and Paranormal Podcast. I'm your host, Christine, and tonight is the Dardeen family murders. Who wanted them gone? So Ina, Illinois is a tiny, and I mean tiny, village in the southernmost part of the state. The closest major metro area is St. Louis, Missouri, and that's about 75 miles away. In 1987, there were only around 500 people who lived in Ina, only around 200 households, if you can picture that. The small town sat in Jefferson County, and Jefferson County wasn't known for having this great reputation at the time. It actually had a pretty unsettling reputation for violence. The population of the county, of this Jefferson County itself at the time, only had about 38,000 residents. But in this county alone, there had been 15 homicides. This is a huge number for such a rural area. Fear was starting to creep into Ina because of this high murder rate. But not everyone, though, was afraid. Many residents still lived without fear. Their doors were left unlocked day and night. But, after the Dardeens were killed in one of the most brutal ways possible, that small fear that they kind of had turned into full-out paranoia. Almost overnight, people were reinforcing their doors and they were purchasing guns as families just armed themselves. The thing is that they didn't know who they were arming themselves against. For some reason, Keith Dardeen had been aware of this danger that surrounded his young family. And he would tell his friends and his family that he wanted to move out of this area as soon as he could. He had even put their mobile home up for sale, and they began to make plans to move. Tragically, though, they wouldn't make it out in time. What happened to the Dardeen family wasn't just another entry in Jefferson County's growing history of unsolved homicides. It was a crime so gruesome, so incomprehensible, that it sent shockwaves through the entire region. And nearly 4 decades later, it remains one of the most haunting murder mysteries in Illinois history. On Wednesday, November 18th, 1987, Keith Dardeen, 29, failed to show up for his shift at the Rend Lake Intercity Water System, where he was a water treatment plant operator. This was definitely out of character for Keith, who was known to show up at least 20 minutes early for his shifts. Now, people at work, they took notice, and they found it really strange that he hadn't called in or had someone cover for him. While there's no public record of it, it can be assumed that his supervisor tried to call the house and reach Keith's wife. When he got no answer there, he then moved to the next contact on Keith's list, which was his mom, Joanne. Now, she lived in Mount Carmel, about 90 miles away. When the supervisor told her that Keith hadn't shown up for work, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. And when she couldn't get a hold of Keith or his family, she began to panic. She knew that Keith desperately wanted to move out of Ina because of the violence in the area. The idea that he didn't show up for work or contacted anyone, especially with his wife taking care of their 3-year-old and being 7 months pregnant, made Joanne very concerned. So Joanne tried to call the home multiple times, but no one answered. This was, as you might imagine, incredibly unusual. Now, Elaine had been taking time off of work due to her pregnancy. And their 3-year-old son, Peter, he wasn't in school yet. Someone should have been home. At 5:30 that night, Joanne then called the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department and requested that they do a welfare check on her son and his family. So deputies arrive at the Dardeen home around 6:30 p.m. And their home was a beige and wood tone mobile home, which was located along Illinois Route 37. This was near the southern edge of Ina. Joanne had arranged to meet the officers there, and she had a spare key, but the deputies actually didn't need it. They found the back door unlocked. The deputies walked inside and sensed that something was wrong. There weren't any signs of forced entries. No windows were broke. The doors didn't show signs of being broken in or jimmied. And it was just so very quiet. When they got to the master bedroom, they found a scene that could only be described as one of unimaginable horror. Lying in the bed were the battered bodies of 30-year-old Elaine Dardeen and her 3-year-old son, Peter. Both of them had been bound with duct tape and bludgeoned to death. As the officers looked over this crime scene, they found something even more disturbing. And brace yourselves, because this is probably the most gruesome and horrendous murder in a crime that I have ever read about. Evidently, the trauma of the attack had sent Elaine into spontaneous labor. And at some point, she gave birth during the attack. This killer or killers, whomever they were, had killed the newborn baby as well, in the same manner as Elaine and her son Peter. The murder weapon was found right there in the room, and it happened to be a baseball bat that Keith had given to his son Peter earlier in the year for his birthday. 3 members of the Dardeen family had been slaughtered in their own home. But where was Keith? He was nowhere in the house, and immediately the police thought that, hey, he's the one responsible. They believed that they were looking for a killer who was now on the run. Keith's car, a 1981 red Plymouth, was gone from the scene. However, what they would discover the next day would flip the case entirely on its head. On Thursday, November 19th, 1987, a group of hunters were walking across a wheat field, which was about a mile from the Dardeen home, when they came across something unusual. As they went to go check it out, they realized that it was a man's body. This man would be identified as Keith Dardeen. He hadn't ran. He had been murdered just like his family. The thing was, though, was that Keith was found with even more trauma. Keith had been shot 3 times, once in the head, twice in the face with a small caliber handgun. He had also been beaten, but authorities never confirmed if it was the same weapon used on Keith that was used on his family. But that's not all. The most disturbing thing at this crime scene was that Keith's penis had been cut off and left beside his body. Now the investigation shifted. Keith wasn't the suspect. He was just another victim. Not long after finding Keith in this wheat field, the police found his red 1981 Plymouth 10 miles away in Benton, Illinois. But this isn't the most bizarre thing. The car was parked near the police station in Benton. It wasn't hidden, it was just left there. Inside the vehicle, police found Keith's blood and signs of a struggle. Now, it didn't take long for the deaths of the Dardeen family to reach the citizens, right? The citizens of Ina. Not only were they in shock, they were petrified. Newspapers then all over the area picked up on this story and interviewed local residents. One resident who lived just 4 houses down from the Dardeens' mobile home said, "I didn't have any idea where my house keys were at. My doors were never locked." Another resident said, "The little kids have nightmares. It's enough to give grown people nightmares." A waitress in town, who was too afraid to give her name, described how her household had changed. "The guns are out and the doors are barricaded at home. At home, we've got 3 women and 4 children and no man. So we got the gun." And the county coroner at the time said someone either had a strong dislike for this family or we have a first-class nut loose in this area. Every truck in town seemed to have a brand new gun rack installed. And people openly admitted to keeping a shotgun by the door just in case this killer returned. Theories ran rampant. Some people believed that it was the work of a psychopath that was passing through town. Others feared it was a serial killer. Some even talked about it being a cult murder fueled by, rumors of devil worshippers in Jefferson County. But no matter what theory people clung to, one thing was for sure. Whoever did this was still out there. And if they had killed once, they could kill again. The local police, they were very aware of this rising hysteria in this small town. A Franklin County coroner also had commented and warned about letting this fear take over completely. And he said, "Other than this being brutal, I have no reason to believe there's a crazed killer out there." He said, "It's time for people to get a hold of themselves." Still, residents could not shake this terror that gripped them. A Mount Vernon gun shop, a place nearby, reportedly sold out of a specific type of weapon as people scrambled to arm themselves. And of the family, they said if you know them, you just can't imagine that they would have any enemies. They were very sweet kids. I don't know what they could possibly do to cause anyone to want to hurt them. As the police began to investigate, more information came out about just how fearful that Keith himself was. And unlike most residents of Ina who left their doors unlocked all the time, at least, before this crime, Keith made sure that his place was secured all the time. A young woman, even at one time, had come and knocked on their door needing to use their phone, and he refused to let her inside. He wanted to move away because of this violence in the area, and he had already put up his mobile home for sale, willing to move back to Mount Carmel as soon as possible, even before he had secured a job there. And Keith's extreme caution compared to how other people acted in town, their more relaxed attitudes of the neighbors, really stands out as kind of a key detail, one that makes this case even more baffling. After the Dardeen family and now Keith were found, there wasn't a whole lot to go on. Usually investigators would begin looking at the people closest to the victims, their friends, coworkers, extended family, or anyone who had a grudge with the family. As they dug in, they didn't find any evidence of affairs. There weren't any criminal ties to the family, although a small quantity of marijuana was found in the home. It hardly screamed, drug lord. No gambling debts, no backdoor deals, no grudges against the family, nothing. They were quiet and responsible. Keith was a dependable worker. Elaine was well liked at work. And even after interviewing hundreds of people, investigators couldn't find anyone that had a reason to commit this heinous crime. Statistically, when a wife and a child are murdered, the husband is often the main suspect. But, Keith was dead too. Nothing was taken from the home, even though electronics and money and jewelry were actually left out in the open. If this was a random act, why had the killer or killers gone to such lengths to get rid of the family? Why drive Keith away in evidently his own vehicle and dump him in the middle of a field? Why was he separated from his family? Why was his car left near a police station? No one kills a family this way without some kind of serious motive. And then there's Keith, right? His particular murder, the severing of a body part, especially the body part that was cut off. It just screams, personal vendetta. So, why were the police not able to narrow down a suspect? You absolutely know that with that bat that was left behind, there had to have been fingerprints, right? DNA. The vehicle had to contain fingerprints as well, unless the person or persons wore gloves, but most certainly there would have also been DNA here too. The thing is that DNA was just in its infancy at the time, and CODIS, the combined DNA index system, which houses DNA from criminals and such, that wasn't even established until 1998. The entire town was in fear. This heinous crime happened in their neighborhood, two people they knew. And since the police hadn't gotten anywhere with anyone, the rumors just ran rampant. There were rumors of satanic cults, of serial killers, and a crazed psychopath just running around their small community. There was no clear motive, and police were stumped. Now, at first, you might think that rumors of satanic cults were a little out there. But in the late 1980s, America was in the grip of what was called the satanic panic. People believed that there were secret Satan worshiping cults all over the United States that were committing crimes like child abuse, sacrifices, and ritual murders. The media played it up. It was covered by talk shows, law enforcement, and even televangelists. It didn't have a lot of evidence behind it, and it eventually did die down in the 90s. But at the time, the Dardeens were murdered. It was definitely something that came to people's minds at the time. Some felt that the mutilation of Keith, as well as the overkill of the entire family, which included a 3-year-old and a newborn, seems ritualistic. One resident said and told a reporter, "We've been hearing things like this for the last 3 years. There are known cults around here, and it's starting to look that way to us." The thing is, there had been rumors of satanic activity in Jefferson County for years, including stories that talked about slaughtered livestock found with their blood drained, strange symbols on barns and abandoned buildings, and gathering of people that seemed ritualistic that was going on late at night. Now, earlier in the year, the same year, there happened to be a rape and a murder of a 10-year-old girl, Amy Schultz. And residents felt that somehow these two cases were connected. Now, ironically, it's said that this crime against this 10-year-old girl is one of the reasons that Keith wanted to move his family out of this little town. Now, investigators did look into this theory about, a cult, but they couldn't find anything. There wasn't anything ritualistic found at the crime scenes. There was no history that Keith or Elaine would have been involved in anything like that. Eventually, they do rule out any evidence of a satanic cult killing. The sheriff saying these were very brutal killings, but not ritual killings. The injuries sustained by Mr. Dardeen differ enough from the other injuries sustained by the other family members that only the killer or someone involved in the investigation would know that. If there was one person who refused to let the world forget about the Dardeen family, it was Joanne Dardeen, Keith's mom. She wasn't just a grieving mother. She became a relentless force, determined to find answers where law enforcement seemed to have none. From the very beginning, Joanne fought to keep this case alive. She called the detectives on a regular basis. She pressed them for updates. She asked what was being done. She refused to let this investigation fade into a cold case status. And when years passed without any progress, she took matters into her own hands. She went ahead and she gathered thousands of signatures in a petition to get the case featured on the Oprah Winfrey Show in the hopes that this would be her plea for getting national exposure, that someone somewhere would come forward with the truth. But the producers turned her down. The case, they said, was just far too graphic for daytime television. But that didn't stop her. She worked tirelessly to get America's Most Wanted to take notice. And after a decade of persistence, they finally aired a segment in 1997. But even that, as promising as it seemed, led nowhere. Years go by, and there's no one in custody, no suspects, absolutely nothing. Then, over 12 years after the Dardeens were killed, Tommy Lynn Sells, a serial killer, confesses to the crime. Tommy Lynn Sells was a serial killer, a drifter, and a self-proclaimed coast-to-coast murderer. He had been arrested for the brutal murder of Kayleen Katie Harris, a 13-year-old girl in Del Rio, Texas. And the only reason that he was caught was because at the time, a 10-year-old who witnessed this, Crystal Searles, survived this attack. She went to a neighbor's house and helped the police identify him. And once in custody, all of a sudden, Sells begins confessing to dozens of murders, claiming that he had killed people across 7 different states, including Illinois. This is finally closure, right? Now people have a person to pin this on. At least you would think so. But here's the thing. Sells' confession and the way that he said that these murders of the Dardeens played out changed all the time. And there wasn't any physical evidence that actually tied him to these murders. Here's actually what he said. His first version was that he claimed that Keith picked him up while he was hitchhiking and then invited him over for dinner. Okay, first of all, we know that Keith was incredibly security conscious, right? He wouldn't even let a young woman in the home to use his telephone. So we know that this probably isn't true. The second version is that he said he met Keith at a pool hall and was later invited to his home. So again, right, same security conscious Keith is probably not going to do this. In the last version, Sells said that he knocked on the Dardeens' door and then forced his way in. Every time Sells retold the story, the details shifted, which, raised immediate red flags for investigators. The thing is that Sells did provide some correct details about the crime scene, but most of these were widely available in the news. And he also got a lot of details wrong, which led investigators to really question his credibility. And again, there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Law enforcement had no confirmation that he was even in Illinois at the time. And finally, and I know we've said this a few times, Keith was hyper vigilant about safety. Would he really have let a complete stranger into his home? Sells also claimed that Keith had suggested a threesome with Elaine, which led to this violent rage that resulted in the murders. Not a single person who knew Keith believed this. Even Keith's mom, Joanne, who initially really wanted to believe Sells' confession, later became skeptical, saying, Tommy deserved to die for what he did, but I wanted him to stay alive until I know positively he didn't do it. Now, despite Sells, quote unquote, confessing, investigators never charged him with the murders. Authorities ultimately dismissed his confession as unreliable, and the case remained unsolved. So did he do it? Well, even today, this kind of remains divisive in the Dardeen case. Some people believe that he just wanted the notoriety and used these false confessions in order to get special treatment, like being taken out of his prison cell for quote unquote field trips in order to discuss the murders. Others argue that his method of killing, which was typically random, brutal, and opportunistic, actually fit the crime. But with no DNA, no eyewitnesses, and no solid proof, most experts, even Keith's family, doubt that he was truly responsible. So what did Joanne think, Keith's mom? Well, Joanne actually wanted to talk to Sells, person to person, face to face. In a 2010 interview, Sells didn't know exactly what this would accomplish, saying, Joanne wants to talk to me. If she wants to come here and talk to me, scream at me, yell, kick me, hit me, she should have that right, he said. But he said that no apology he could make could possibly give her closure. Sorry ain't going to cut it. So what is there to say? I could tell her sorry every day for the rest of my life. It's not going to stop her pain. And one thing I do know about is pain, and it don't go away. Now, Joanne and Sells, they never did get a chance to talk because Sells was executed in 2014. But at that point in time, Joanne did not believe that he was the one who had committed the murders. Then there were suspicions that it was another random killer, a man by the name of Angel Resendiz, also known as the Railway Killer. He too was a serial killer. He was known for bludgeoning families who lived near train tracks. The Dardeens lived near a train track. The pattern of his murders matched his MO. Now, he was a drifter and a serial killer who committed at least 23 murders across the United States between, it is said, 1986 to 1999. Now, sometimes he shot victims using objects that were found at the crime scene. He was known for killing entire families, not just one individual person. Now, it matched to an extent, and he was known to be in St. Louis several times in the 80s and less than 90 miles from Ina, Illinois, around the time of the murders. So after investigators looked at him, they became a little skeptical because evidently his crime spree did not begin in the 80s, but in the 90s. He was known to break into homes, and there was no forced entry found at the Dardeen home. Keith was known to be very cautious about security. It's very, very, very likely that his doors were locked. Plus, his victims were random, yet many people believe that the killing of the Dardeen family was very personal or revenge-based. Now, the former lead investigator of the Dardeen case, Charles Parker, stated, "Sure, they lived near railroad tracks, and it's something that should be kept in mind, but from what I've seen personally, the likelihood is not very high." Now, others weren't so quick to dismiss this. Another investigator on the case suggested that forensic evidence from the crime scene should be compared to this killer's known killings in order to rule him out for good. Now, if this guy was in the area, it's entirely possible that he used the railway system to escape. But without forensic proof or a confession, his involvement is just pretty much speculation. Unlike Tommy Lynn Sells, Resendiz never confessed to killing the Dardeens. So was it then a personal vendetta? Keith had grown very paranoid. Was there something he was afraid of? Was he the original target and the family just happened to get in the way? He had told his mom, Joanne, that he wanted to move away from Ina. He was so nervous that he refused to let a woman use his phone when she knocked on the door, and their mobile home was already up for sale, even though he still didn't have a job lined up in Mount Carmel, which is where he wanted to go. Keith didn't treat his home the way that other Ina residents did. Who felt safe enough to keep their doors unlocked at all times. Keith did not. And there was no forced entry. So did he let someone inside? Someone that he would have trusted? But if Keith had no known enemies, who could have wanted him dead? Now, one of the theories is that the Dardeen family was not the actual target, but rather a warning to someone else. The severe overkill of Elaine and her children suggested some kind of extreme rage or a desire to send a message. Keith was killed differently. He was bludgeoned and shot and had a personal body part removed. He was also dumped separately from his family, which is unusual in typical home invasion cases. So was it a warning to someone that Keith knew? Maybe at work, maybe in the community. Did Keith see or know something that put his family at risk? One of the most frustrating aspects of the Dardeen case is actually the lack of forensic breakthroughs. In the nearly 40 years since the murders, DNA technology has advanced significantly. offering the potential to identify unknown perpetrators even in the coldest of cases. So, why hasn't DNA solved this crime? Investigators believe that the killer or killers would have likely left behind DNA evidence at both crime scenes, within the car, at somewhere in the wheat field, or on Keith's body, and at the house. However, police are being incredibly, even after all this time, tight-lipped about what evidence actually exists. One investigator says, "We don't know what, if anything, has been submitted for DNA testing in the case." This kind of secrecy, if you will, has led to speculation. Did the crime scene yield usable DNA? Has this evidence degraded over time? Was it maybe not taken care of as it should have been? What we do know is that blood evidence was recovered from the crime scenes. The baseball bat that was used in the murders was also collected and analyzed somehow. There was a possible attempt to try and clean up the crime scene, but details on what forensic traces remained there were very unclear. One of the major challenges was that Keith's body was found outside, meaning that any potential DNA evidence on his clothes or his body may have been compromised. And, absolutely, DNA today with forensic genealogy, this is the same technology that helped identify the Golden State Killer, has led to breakthroughs in decades-old unsolved cases. So far, there's been no public confirmation that law enforcement has actually pursued these options. Now, personally, I have a lot of questions about this case that just don't seem to have an answer. A big one for me, at least, was that in a town that small, in a town of 500 people, you would think that someone would have talked, especially this many years later. And it really does, doesn't it, seem highly unlikely that no one would have overheard something, noticed suspicious behavior, or even had suspicions about someone in the community. If the crime was committed by locals, the odds are very high that someone has or does know something but has chosen not to speak up. If they chose to stay tight-lipped about the thing, there's many things that this could, or reasons why this could be. The fear of retaliation. They may have feared for their own safety. The people who did the crime may have moved away. Someone actually did talk, but nobody paid any attention. Or the crime was committed by an outsider. And probably one of my biggest questions is, what kind of person or people have no issues about murdering children, especially a baby? This seems particularly heinous to me. This level of brutality and lack of remorse, because obviously if they felt remorse, they would have come forward, right? Significantly narrows down the type of person who would commit such a heinous act like this. And you know that, especially with the use of the baseball bat, that was so personal. And they would have had to look not only the child in the eyes, but Eileen as well, as they're bludgeoning them. One of the things that really seemed to fit this case was that of just a revenge killing or a personal vendetta. Obviously, very, very extreme rage towards the victims, especially Keith, kills the others to maybe eliminate witnesses. If the rage is aimed at Keith, the family may have been just collateral damage. If it was aimed at Eileen, the killer may have wanted Keith to suffer before he died. And in some of the research that I did, this just kind of turns my stomach, in some love triangles or cases of betrayal, children are often killed out of sheer rage and just cruelty. It's very possible that this is what fits the Dardeen case. If Keith had problems with someone in town and knew something he shouldn't have or refused to be a part of something, this could explain the extreme violence. But why kill a newborn? A newborn. This is way beyond normal criminal behavior. And it actually suggests a total lack of empathy. a desire to eliminate every witness or trace of the family, not that the baby was going to be able to be a witness in any way, shape, or form, extreme anger at the mom or dad or both of them, and someone completely unhinged, whether due to rage, psychopathy, or group dynamics, for example. Many killers who commit home invasion murders actually leave infants alive because they don't see them as a threat. For someone to beat a newborn to death minutes after birth, it just shows pure malice or extreme detachment from humanity. And you would think that a person like this would stick out like a sore thumb, right, in the community. And it's often been asked as well, does this crime indicate one or two perpetrators? We don't have a lot to go on, but there are actually strong arguments for both sides. While the murder of Elaine, Peter, and the newborn was very chaotic, the murder of Keith was kind of more controlled. And some serial killers and sadistic murderers are capable of shifting between these frenzied behaviors and controlled behaviors within the same crime. A gun was used for Keith, a gun and a bat was used for Keith, and a bat for the rest of the family. Now, this could suggest one person who changed weapons based on necessity. Maybe the gun was too loud and they thought that, something might be overheard by neighbors. The killer may have run out of bullets or preferred to kill Elaine and the children in a more hands-on way. Some home invasion killers like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, he carried out brutal multi-person murders all by himself. If this was a single person who did this, they were likely a highly, highly violent, remorseless individual, either a sadist or someone in an extreme rage. We do know that Eileen and Peter, the 3-year-old, had been duct taped. So how did they grab Keith? Well, Keith was likely subdued at gunpoint, right? Because he was shot. So if the killer had this gun, they could have easily just forced Keith into the car alone while the rest of the family was tied up. But at some point, the rest of the family was also murdered. So was someone left in the house, or did they go back and do it? The problem is that there's so little information that has been released publicly about this, we do not know. While police interviewed hundreds of people, no one was ever arrested or officially named a suspect. The thing is, during these interviews, it's probably pretty likely that they actually did already speak to the killer, but they didn't have enough evidence and they couldn't pin it on this person or these people. And it wasn't just the Ina Police Department that was involved in this. It was the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, and the Illinois State Police Division of Criminal Investigation. And there was actually a task force that was officially formed to investigate these murders. So with all of these people searching through all of this evidence and questioning all of these potential suspects, it's hard to believe that nobody was actually arrested for this crime. Despite all of these leads, all of these people that they spoke to, the case still remains unsolved, even today. Who wanted this family dead? And why? What do you think, listeners, was the true motive behind this crime? Was it personal? Or was the family simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Who do you think came to the home? How do you think the person was able to get into the home? Do you believe that Tommy Sell's confession was real? Or do you think that he was just trying to get attention? Do you think it was one person or more than one person? And why has nobody come forward after all of these years? And what do you make of Keith's car being left near a police station? Was this intentional or was it just coincidence? If you have a theory about this case, I would love to hear it. Just drop a comment on the YouTube channel. And if you or someone you know has any information that could help solve this case, please contact the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Their phone number is 618-244-8004 or the Illinois State Police at 217-786-7107. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow Beach House 34 on your favorite podcast platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel for more true crime and paranormal stories. And if you want to support the show, head on over to Patreon. I'll have my link in the description below. And what you can find there is I say a lot of things in my episodes, but you should hear the bloopers. Not only that, you get early access to the full entire episode completely ad-free. So come hang out over at Patreon. And again, I'll have the link for you in the show notes below. Thank you so much, so much for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. We'll talk soon. Bye for now.